It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Samsung Odyssey G60SD. As usual for video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. In the description of the video, you'll find links to additional content as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 27-inch Samsung display QD-OLED panel with a 2560 by 1440, that's 1440p or QHD resolution. It also supports a 360Hz refresh rate. So the resolution and the screen size combination, many will be very familiar with this. It offers a good amount of desktop real estate, decent for work purposes and a little bit of multitasking as well. And it also allows the monitor to provide a fairly crisp and detailed look to suitably high resolution image content. And that will include games. In terms of the overall clarity and the text, well, it looks pretty crisp, but there are some fringing issues to be aware of, which I will cover shortly. Although in my view, they're a bit more on the minor side on this model compared to some OLED models. I'm now going to look at the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some things related to that. This image shows the monitor connected via DisplayPort. You've got up to 360Hz and it supports that at up to 10 bits per channel. You also get HDR support at the same time and VRR. You can use adaptive sync, so you can use AMD FreeSync as well as Nvidia G-Sync compatible. Via HDMI, more of the same, except that you have up to 12 bits per channel. Now, this doesn't mean it's going to give you an advantage for the vast majority of content. There's really a very slim amount of content that will actually make use of 12 bits per channel. But if you're a creator and you want to make use of 12 bits per channel for your creations, or you are looking at very specific content and you can actually make use of 12 bits per channel, then this could be potentially useful. And via HDMI, you also get VRR support. It has HDMI 2.1 VRR, so you can use that on the PS5, for example. And it also means you can use Nvidia G-Sync compatible if you've got an Nvidia GPU. For those interested, these are high bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports. You get 40 gigabits per second. When connected with HDMI, there is also a 4K UHD downsampling mode, which is supported at up to 60 Hz. And that could be useful on the Xbox Series X, for example, where it will only support HDR with a 4K UHD signal being used. But be aware that adaptive sync must be disabled in the OSD to use this resolution. Just going to take a quick look at the scaling capability of the monitor. I'm on Battlefield 5. This is running the native 2560 by 1440 resolution at the moment. The monitor does use interpolation. It has a scaling process which can be used for lower resolutions. So I'm running the full HD resolution at the moment with 360Hz refresh rate. And you'll see in information it does display 1920 by 1080 360Hz. So the monitor is using its own scaling. It does support this at up to 360Hz for the full HD resolution. It's a softer look than you get on a native 27-inch Full HD model. It's not super soft, doesn't give the kind of soft focus look I've seen on some models, but it could do with a bit of sharpening. Unfortunately, the monitor does have a sharpness control in the picture section of the menu. So you can increase that in increments of 1 from 10, which is the default, or you could decrease it if you want, but increasing it will increase the sharpness, increasing it beyond 10. All the way up to 20, it gives quite an over-sharpened look. I mean, some people might like it here, but I think this has really gone too far. I'd say you could go up to maybe 16. It really just depends on your viewing distance, your own subjective preferences, but I think increasing the sharpness to 15 or 16 is a pretty good way to go for the full HD resolution. In the game section of the menu, there is a screen size setting that's set to wide by default, and with that it will try and use all of the pixels of the screen, it will fill them up, regardless of the source resolution. If you select auto, then what that will do, or what that should do, is it should look at the aspect ratio of the resolution you've selected and it will try and stick to that. So the full HD resolution is 16 by 9 anyway, so that doesn't make a difference. There's also a setting called ultra wide game view, and you need to have adaptive sync disabled to use that. And what that does is it switches the monitor over to 2560 by 1080, which is an ultra-wide 21 by 9 aspect ratio resolution. It does support this at up to 360Hz, but again, you can't use VRR at the same time. You have to have adaptive sync disabled. But this will give you a wider horizontal field of view by default in games, and you'll get the same vertically, but of course you'll get these black bars at the top and bottom because it's a 21 by 9 rather than 16 by 9 aspect ratio. I'm now going to cover the external features of the monitor. So it has a nice low-profile stand base with a coated metal finish. That gives a nice solid look and feel to things. The neck is plastic though, but it's a pretty solid feeling plastic. It has a good weight to it anyway. There's a little underhanging Samsung logo centrally on the bottom bezel. The monitor has a dual-stage bezel design, so there are slim panel borders flush with the rest of the screen, as well as a hard outer component, and that is silver colour in this case. I definitely have to talk a little bit about the screen surface. So a matte screen surface is used here, as you can no doubt see, and that distinguishes it from competing QD-OLED models which use a glossy, or what some might call semi-glossy screen surface. The matte screen surface used here offers extremely effective glare handling, diffusing ambient light heavily right across the screen. So this is quite a bright room, and there is some direct light striking the screen surface there, and it does diffuse those reflections very effectively right across the screen surface. If I were to broadly categorise this screen surface based on glare handling alone, I might consider it heavy or heavy to medium, but usually such screen surfaces will have an obvious 3D structure which will include a lot of graininess, layering, or a generally smeary look to the image when the screen is switched on. I'll explore these aspects later on when the screen is switched on, and I'm talking about contrast, but I'm pleased to say the screen surface doesn't exhibit those properties. As with the glossy QD-OLED models, there is a general lightening up of darker shades and brighter lighting, and sometimes a little bit of a colourful tint is introduced. You can see that in this lighting, for example. Although in this case, it isn't something you would observe in isolation in the way that you might on glossy surfaces. The heavily diffused light across the screen naturally lightens up darker shades anyway. This would occur with a similar matte screen surface on another monitor technology that didn't have the QD-OLED lightening up effect anyway. It also tends to mute any colourful tints, the matte screen surface and the diffusion of light, so that I would say that they are somewhat less noticeable than they are on the glossy QD-OLEDs. You can see from the side that at its thinnest point the screen is very slim indeed. It does bulk out towards the stand attachment point, but still gives it a slender overall side profile. At the rear, the monitor is mainly silver colour, except for this noticeable glossy black region in the middle. I'm not a fan of glossy black plastics, but at least it's used sparingly here. There are also a rim of RGB LEDs surrounding this glossy area. And just to give you a quick demonstration of the lighting feature, that is the lighting using its Aura Cycle feature. So it basically casts a rainbow on the wall behind the monitor. And you can actually see that in a dim room. It's not super bright, it's not particularly bright. So if you're in a bright room, you're not going to be seeing this. And even in a dark room, it doesn't exactly act as a bias light or something which I think is going to really improve viewing comfort in any meaningful way. But it does give a little bit of ambience. It is something that you can appreciate from the front and not just the back of the screen. So they call it infinity core lighting. There are a few other settings you can use for this. You can turn the lighting off as well, by the way, if you wish. So that was the Aurora rotation. Aurora just gives you a static rainbow, so it doesn't cycle around. And just to show you that when the screen goes into standby, it does turn the lighting feature off. The other lighting effects, there is Comet. I'm not going to spend too long going through these, don't worry. There's static, which to be honest is my preferred. I mean, I do quite like the Aurora to be honest, but sometimes I like to just have a static colour. So this is just a static orange behind the screen. But if you press that colour, you'll see there's a nice palette of colours available, lots of different options there. There's also rainbow. Unlike Aurora, that just uses one colour for all of the lighting elements and it just cycles through them one by one. There's also breathing, and you can control the colour of that as well. Also, if you have it set to static, possibly some other things, I'm not sure, there is a core sync feature you can use. And what that will do is it will sync up the lighting to the image that's being displayed. And it reacts pretty rapidly as well to changes in the image. So back to the silver colour. The bottom there, it's plastic, like the stand neck, whereas the rest it's metal, a bit more like the stand base. At the top you can see some ventilation slat. The monitor uses a liquid cooling system, a dynamic heat pipe cooling system, I believe they call it. So it doesn't rely on a fan, it doesn't have an active cooling fan. You can also detach the included stand with a quick release catch. You just nudge that up and there is provision for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting to use as an alternative. If you're making use of the included stand, you get good ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the screen, you can swivel it left and right, You can pivot it into portrait, and you can also adjust the height. You get 120mm of height adjustment, which is 4.72 inches, and that's with it at the lowest stand height, so it doesn't go particularly low compared to some monitors, and that's the highest stand height. And I should also mention that the depth of the stand, it's reasonably compact actually for a gaming monitor, especially Samsung monitors. The Samsung Odyssey models sometimes have a ridiculous stand design which takes up a lot of desk depth. This one doesn't. It's 264mm or 10.39 inches, and that includes this little rubber cable tie. You can remove that if you wish, which will give you a little bit of extra room, but it's kind of flexible anyway and squishy. The OSD control joystick and the ports face backwards beneath the stand attachment point. There are two USB 3.0 ports as well as a Type B upstream port. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack, two HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and a DC power input, so the monitor uses an external power brick. Just to note, the monitor does not include any integrated speakers. Taking a quick look now at the subpixels of the monitor. This monitor, as usual for QD-OLED, it has a triangle subpixel design, so it has RGB, red, green and blue, but the green subpixel is displaced above the red and the blue. The bottom image here shows this monitor, which I'm going to call it Gen 2.5 QD-OLED panel. The top left shows the first generation QD-OLED panel used on the 34-inch 3440 by 1440 models, and the top right you can see the second gen QD-OLED used on the 49-inch 5120 by 1440 models. So something that's changed with the Gen 2 and is also found in the Gen 2.5, the panel used here, is that it has a more squared out subpixel design. I know it's not so easy to see this subpixel design in the Gen 2.5 image. That's just because it has a matte screen surface. The camera wasn't able to focus on the image as well from up close, so it needs to be taken from a little bit further back. So that's why the subpixels look a bit smaller, but they're definitely squared out just like the second gen. And yes, this does indeed reduce the fringing. And the fringing on QD-OLEDs, it's not related to clear type specifically, it's related to high contrast situations, particularly if you've got white against black or light colours against darker backgrounds or vice versa. This doesn't have to be text, although it can be text, but in the description of the video I've got an article covering this. I'm not going to cover it here because there's really nothing good to be added from trying to show you exaggerated examples in a video which aren't really representative of what your eye will see, but definitely do look at the examples in the article. There are a few given there, and there's also a little link to some commentary that I made in one of the video reviews for second gen QD-OLED panel, where I just said that basically the fringe is thinner with the squared out subpixel design, and yes, that does apply here as well, that the fringing is thinner and less noticeable than it was on the first gen QD-OLED panels, but it's still a bit more noticeable than it is on the so-called third gen QD-OLED panels, and they're the ones used on the 32-inch 4K UHD models. Taking a look now at the calibration of the monitor. So the first table, that shows various different monitor settings and the recorded central average gamma and white point, recorded using a Datacolor SpiderX Elite color emitter. So out of the box, the gamma average is 2.1, white point 6518K with a fairly neutral green channel. And changing the color space to normal or auto, what that does, so normal is a DCI-P3 emulation setting, which clamps the gamut close to DCI-P3 rather than the standard gamut, which extends beyond DCI-P3, and I will be exploring this more shortly. And auto, that clamps it to sRGB, so that's an sRGB color space emulation setting. I also like to explore the low blue light settings a little bit, so color tone warm 2 is an effective low blue light setting, and there are also the eye saver mode low blue light settings. I do talk about these a little bit more in the best settings video, by the way, if you're interested in the kind of effect they have on the image. But you can see from the readings here that the main thing is that it gives a much warmer look to the image. And warm 2 I particularly like because it's quite balanced visually. It gives an amber tint to the image, which I find quite relaxing in the evenings. That's when you might particularly like to use this kind of setting. With my test settings, I was able to achieve a gamma of 2.2, central average gamma, and a white point of 6504K. So I will come back to the gamma here shortly, but you can see in the second bit of the table, or the second table there, how the monitor was set up for my test settings. Basically, I'm just using eco mode, set brightness to 28, made a few adjustments to the red, green and blue color channels, or the green and blue color channel more specifically, and this is all explored a bit more in the best settings video. And as I say at the bottom there, individual units and preferences vary. These settings won't be optimal in all cases. ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but they have been included in the video description if you wish to try them out. And one was created using the test settings, and the other with the colour space set to auto, and the brightness set to 28, which is the same as my test settings brightness. The top graph that shows my test settings, the 2.2 average gamma recorded. It's actually quite similar with the monitor set to 50 brightness, which is full brightness on this model, by the way. For some reason, the brightness control goes up to 50, which is the maximum, rather than 100 being the maximum. That's just how it is. But if you use a low brightness on the monitor, being set to 6, which it was set to, or at least my unit was set to by default in the eco mode setting, that gives you a 2.1 average gamma, and you can see more deviation from the desired curve and the recorded curve of the monitor. But coming back to the test settings, which is what I'm more interested in, the gamma tracking is actually quite good. There's a little bit of deviation, not too obvious with the resolution of this graph, but there's a little bit of deviation. However, it's pretty good actually at the low end, which is where I'm most concerned about it. Reason for that is that if the gamma's too high here, it will mask detail too much, dark detail too much. And if it's too low, it will make dark details too visible and give a sort of artificial or flooded look, an unatmospheric look. And I don't like any of this. I like it to be closer to 2.2 for darker shades, and indeed my unit was when set up per my test settings. Also like to explore the colour accuracy using an sRGB emulation setting, so the colour space set to auto in this case. And you'll see here that the colour accuracy isn't exactly great. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. The average delta E recorded is 2.18, and this, by the way, is using the Spider Checker 24 test patches. The maximum error is shade 1F cerulean, as it often is. This shade is one where the colorimeter is super sensitive to the balance of blue versus green, and you'll often see this as the highest error. But even so, there are clear errors elsewhere. This graph here looks much better, and all I've done is I've increased the brightness to 28, which is the same as my test settings, around 160 nits, rather than the default brightness of 6, which is a very low brightness. And to be honest, lower than the vast majority of people are actually going to be using on the monitor. So yes, it tidies up the gamma, it tidies up the colour accuracy. Shade 1F has dropped a bit to 5.55 for the delta E. It was 6.25 before, by the way. And the average delta E has dropped from 2.18 to 0.92, which is much more impressive. Moving on now to brightness and contrast. Some readings here taken using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, which is now branded a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus. So you'll see that there's a range for the white luminance values. The black luminance value is always recorded as 0 in this test because it's an OLED monitor, and that gives it an infinite contrast ratio in this test. But the reason the white luminance values have a range displayed is because there is a white square in the center of the screen surrounded by various different shades of different desktop wallpapers, and I display a large range of them. There's pure black, there's pure white, and there are loads of different shade mixtures in between various different photos and pictures. And the monitor does have ABL automatic brightness limiter behavior as usual for an OLED. It's fairly gentle, as you can see in the table in this case, so the range 251 to 258 in most cases, and that's the same whether you've got the colour space set to native, which uses the full gamut, or you're using one of the emulation settings, so normal or auto, DCI-P3 or sRGB in other words. So this level of brightness, that is going to be sufficient for most people. Most people are going to set their monitor somewhere between 100 and 200 nits. So this satisfies that, no problem. Some people do, of course, like a much higher brightness, higher than OLEDs like this will provide for SDR. The minimum brightness recorded was 16 nits, which is nice and low. Under my test settings with this colorimeter, I recorded 168 to 171 nits. Moving on now to the contrast performance of the monitor, I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, this wasn't actually the scene I was originally going to use, but I thought for a bit of variety I'd use a slightly different scene to what I usually use. But the usual OLED contrast advantages do apply. So you've got per pixel illumination, so the monitor is able to shut off some pixels or make them very dark, so almost shut them off depending on the shade which is required. And then right next to that you can have a pixel which is potentially fully illuminated or really anywhere between those values. With that you get some really nice distinct shadow details. Well, speaking of distinctness, in the best settings video I explore various different little tricks, if you like, or settings on the monitor which will enhance the visibility if you like that kind of thing. But really what I'm talking about here is just the natural variety you get from the exceptional contrast. It also, because it's an OLED, you don't suffer from any kind of glow on the screen. So there's no IPS glow, there's no VA glow, there's no sort of central black crush and over brightening peripherally or anything like that. And really just you have exceptional gamma consistency. So the gamma which I was talking about before, which is measured in the center of the screen, you don't have to worry about perceived gamma shifts at different points of the screen. The consistency is truly exceptional. It also allows the monitor to give an inkier and more solid look to medium shades, such as plenty which are being displayed in this scene at the moment. And again, that is consistent throughout the screen, so even at the very corners of the screen, you get the full solidity of the shade. This just isn't a look which you get on LCD monitors. I've now brightened the room up significantly, and the experience now is distinctly different to what you'd see on a glossy QD-OLED model. So you don't get distinct or even muted reflections, and glare is diffused very readily across the screen surface, so even sharp glare patches are avoided. So I've got bright direct light striking the screen there, for example, and you can see a glare patch, and you can see my hand when I wave it like that, but it certainly doesn't have a reflection, and it doesn't really have a sharp glare patch just from the light there. On the flip side, with this heavy diffusion, it also creates a sort of hazing of the image, which reduces perceived contrast. So the haze of the diffused ambient light, it's competing with the image, and that doesn't happen on a glossy screen surface outside of any distinct reflections you might observe. As I noted earlier, the diffused haze seems to blend in with the QD-OLED related structural brightening, which I'm going to call it, and mutes colourful tints to a degree. So this aspect is less distinct than on glossy QD-OLEDs. It's not completely eliminated, but because the glare blends in with any potential colourful tint or any lightening up of the screen surface, it just makes it, I feel, less noticeable. Matte WOLEDs in comparison, they don't offer such effective glare handling, and they diffuse glare much less heavily. So you don't get so much of an even hazing of the image from ambient light, but you can get sharper glare patches and distinct areas of the screen with much lower perceived contrast than other areas. So in a way, they're somewhere between what this monitor shows and a glossy screen in that respect. Back to the darkness now, and observing brighter shades. Now, given how effective the glare handling is, the screen surface actually has a surprisingly smooth finish, and there's a lack of an obvious layered appearance in front of the image. Actually, I'd say it's about as smooth as matte screen surfaces come, to be honest, in terms of the level of perceived graininess, without anything approaching a sandy or smeary appearance. It's significantly less grainy than WOLED models, including even the glossy Asus XG27AQ DMG, and I perceive less layering in front of the image than the matte WOLED models, which means you aren't really aware of the 3D structure of the screen surface, and that's a good thing. It's still not technically as smooth as glossy QD-OLED surfaces, and you don't get the same direct emission of light from the monitor that glossy screen surfaces provide. But I would say that the combination of extremely effective glare handling and smooth finish without obvious layering means that many will find this screen surface rather agreeable. So yeah, I mean, it really does come down to personal preferences, the screen surface, glossy versus matte. Personally, I do quite like the glossy QD-OLED models, but I completely understand that some people prefer matte screen surfaces. And if you do like matte screen surfaces, but you don't like the kind of graininess or layering that can come with it, then I think this screen surface is actually quite a nice compromise. A bit of reduction in the colourful tints and the lightening up you can observe in brighter environments can be nice as well, but you do have to be aware again of that diffusion of light across the screen, which isn't something you get on a glossy screen surface, and that does compete with the image and it does haze it up. So the sort of perceived pop, the perceived contrast isn't the same because of that. I'm now on lagom.nl, the website, and I'm going to talk a bit about colour consistency, how a given shade will appear at different points of the screen. And the Lagom text test, the background there appears a nice blended grey, and the text is consistent with a slight orange striping to the text throughout the screen. There aren't obvious shifts between green and orange and red at different points of the screen, so this all indicates a good low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, as you'd hope for from an OLED. The purple block, to the eye at least, that appears a good consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen, often appears odd on the video. The red block, good rich red throughout the screen. The green block, quite a vibrant green chartreuse shade throughout the screen. The blue block, good royal blue throughout the screen. So excellent consistency for these solid shades. I also observed a range of solid dark shades as well to look for DSE, dirty screen effect, which can affect some OLEDs. It tends to affect WOLEDs more than QD-OLEDs though, and that was the case here as well. It really wasn't an issue, only the most minor striations for some very specific shades, and really nothing of concern. I'm on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So for games like this, or if you're just browsing the internet, you're watching video content, usually it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. Certainly under SDR this is the case. If you're using a gamut on the monitor which extends beyond this, then you invite extra vibrancy and extra saturation. The gamut of this monitor, the native gamut, extends way beyond sRGB. So I recorded 98% DCI-P3 coverage, and you can see quite a bit of extension beyond in some regions. And that also gives you a strong Adobe RGB coverage for those interested. 95% Adobe RGB I recorded in this case. So very generous gamut, a lot of extra saturation, a lot of extra vibrancy. So some shades are certainly presented in a more saturated way than the developers would intend. So the camouflage pattern of this vehicle, for example, there are lots of green shades which don't look as muted as they should. A lot of pop to them. The same with the tree here. Some greens, not so bad here, although some of the greens actually shown for this tree do show it a bit. They have really an overly bright neon appearance. Sort of in this, you can't really see this in the video, but to my eye, the stems of the branches here, they look quite unnaturally bright, almost neon in appearance. The sky has extra pop as well, doesn't look as muted as it should, and there's an extra reddish or orange quality brought out to earthy browns. The sand here, woody tones, skin tones can show this as well. I wouldn't say characters tend to look sunburnt necessarily, but a little bit sun-kissed, too rich in their skin tones quite often. If you want to tone things down a bit, then you could set the colour space to normal instead of native. This is a DCI-P3 emulation setting, so you can see the gamut now is clamped close to DCI-P3. You do lose a little bit of DCI-P3 coverage compared to native, so it was 98% I recorded natively, now it's down to 97%. Negligible difference really in that respect, but it gets rid of that over coverage. So the resulting look to the image, it mainly tones down the greens and the blues, so the sky looks a bit more natural, but there's still a lot of extra pop in places anyway because it does extend quite a bit beyond sRGB still, even if it is cut down compared to natively. And the sort of neon-y look, it's not really there to the same extent, although there are some slightly brighter than intended greens. And the sort of reddish orange hue to the earthy brown skin tones and that kind of thing, it is toned down a bit as well, but again, it is there to some extent. The fires look rich and orange, without verging so much on red as they do natively, but some of the oranges definitely are deeper than they should be. If you want to tone things down further, then you can set colour space to auto, which is the sRGB emulation setting. So here's the gamut recorded now, 98% sRGB coverage, so just a little bit of under coverage, not a huge amount, but really very little, if any, over coverage to speak of. So this is actually really good clamping of the gamut, close to sRGB. So this gives a much more muted look, the fire there for example. The greens of the palm trees are much more muted now as well. The sky is more of a greyish blue and the sand looks more neutral, and I'd say the same for woody tones which I observe elsewhere, and skin tones as well. More appropriate with the sRGB colour space in mind. So I'm just going to switch back over to the native colour space. Definitely a lot more vibrancy, a lot more pop. But if you consider the exceptional colour consistency I talked about with Lagom as well, that means that the vibrancy is maintained throughout the entire screen. This is also attractive for colour critical work or colour accurate output on the monitor, having the shades displayed this consistently throughout the screen. And in terms of colour critical work, it's nice having the various emulation settings, and also they are unrestricted emulation settings, so you can change things like the colour channels, you can change the brightness, you can change the gamma setting as well, so you get a lot of control. It doesn't lock you off in any way. And because of the gamut, you get really nice potential for work within the DCI-P3 colour space, you get very good potential within the Adobe RGB colour space and also the sRGB colour space. So it's actually quite flexible if you do want to use the monitor for colour accurate work. As usual, best results are going to be if you calibrate the monitor with your own colorimeter or similar device, if you have access to that at least. So if you take that kind of thing seriously, then it is something I'd recommend. And just to quickly demonstrate, the colour consistency is not only excellent from a normal viewing position, but also if you view the monitor off angle, it really just looks like a picture. Any shifts you see, well, they're really more from the camera adjusting itself than on the screen itself. By eye, it very much looks like you're looking at a picture on the wall in terms of how consistent the image is and how little it really shifts compared to an LCD monitor. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm going to explore the HDR performance of the monitor. I've got the game running under HDR. The monitor responds to HDR10 content, such as this. In the best settings video, I explore the various different options which you can set under HDR, because on this monitor you get full control of the menu under HDR, which is really a good and a bad thing. Good in terms of tweakability, I guess you could say, but bad because people can often get overwhelmed with the number of settings you can change, and they'll change things and mess the image up in various ways, or not know how they should set things up. So that's why I do have the best settings guide, which I'd highly recommend looking at, the video. But just to reiterate a few things, you can use adaptive sync, so you can use VRR at the same time as HDR on this monitor. That isn't a problem. I'm using eco mode for the picture mode, full brightness, and I will talk about the peak brightness setting, which I've got set to high at the moment, and that's my preference, and that's what I'll set it for most of the review. But there's also a medium and a low setting. So the graphs here, they show the HDR luminance at various different patch sizes. Some reviewers would call this percentage window. You've got a white patch in the middle of the screen. In the case of 100%, it's the entire screen being white, and the rest of the screen displays pure black for this test. The blue line, that shows the peak brightness set to high. The purple line shows peak brightness set to medium, and the orange line shows peak brightness set to off. So the high setting is basically your display HDR peak 1000 style setting, and it's very much in line with what you'll see on other QD-OLEDs using that kind of setting. So it peaks at 1020 nits, and that's for a 1% window that's recorded. For a 4% window on this test, I recorded 909 nits, which is pretty bright, but slightly lower than some QD-OLEDs will display for that particular patch size. And then it drops to 520 nits for 9% patch, and ultimately down all the way to 280 nits for 100% white. And that's a sustained reading, whereas the others are peak. So the sustained reading means that the shade is displayed for 30 seconds before the reading is taken. The purple and orange lines, they're more in line with the Visa Display HDR True Black 400 style settings, with medium being a little bit brighter than off. But you'll see the experience is more consistent there. It doesn't peak as high, but it also means that the lowest brightness is closer to the highest brightness displayed. There are some other ways in which these kind of settings are more consistent, and I will be exploring that a little bit later on. So back on the game, you get 10-bit color processing under HDR, which coupled with the per pixel illumination gives a lovely nuanced shade variety, so a really nice variety of closely matching dark and very dark shades, and medium dark shades as well, as you can see in the scene here, or you could see to the eye what I'm talking about in the scene here. So the shadow details are really nice, and there's a nice variety. There's not just sort of pure black, and it does have really nice depth to the very dark shadow elements there. The medium shades have good depth and inkiness as well, and just a great variety of shades outside of that. And you can have a much brighter shade next to a much darker shade without any kind of haloing or anything like that. So the crosshair here, for example, surrounded by the very dark shadowy detail, there's no halo at all. Per pixel illumination, excellent precision. The outside here contrasts very nicely with the darker shades here. Jumping into the water now, considering brighter shades. So the 10-bit color processing helps here as well, but it helps in terms of the monitor putting its color gamut to good use, the precision used there. It also helps with weather effects, such as the mist on the water here and the light streaming in. The nice smooth gradients there. You can see this elsewhere. It's up to the developers to implement this kind of thing well, and some scenes in games and some games in general will make better use of these smoother gradients than others, but it is something I just generally notice under HDR when I compare to SDR. Another thing which is very noticeable in this scene is the brightness of this glint on the water here. I measured this as a maximum of 846 nits, although it drops down as low as 627 nits. It really just depends on how large the sun is, because the ABL automatic brightness limiter behavior can kick in sometimes. But it mainly sticks closer to the upper end, so closer to 846 nits. So it's not as bright as I've seen on some QD-OLEDs. It's definitely still on the bright side, and not really substantially lower than I've seen on any other QD-OLEDs for this particular element. And it can display the lovely brightness there with an immediate transition to nice deep looking medium shades for the water, and a lovely array of medium and dark shades elsewhere. Again, little shadow details, fine shadow details displayed in a very nice dark and deep fashion, with brighter shades, medium shades directly surrounding them. So it's all displayed very nicely in that respect. And to mention at this point as well, the colour temperature, you can actually adjust the colour channels under HDR on this monitor. As I said, you get a lot of control on this one, which is really good for flexibility. So if you need to make adjustments there, you can. But my unit, it's sat around 6600K with a good neutral green channel. So I didn't touch these. And if you do adjust the colour channels, then you will reduce your peak brightness capabilities. Of course, minor adjustments aren't going to make a huge difference, but just be aware if you're making major adjustments, you will be sacrificing brightness. I'm on Cyberpunk 2077 now, running the game under HDR, and I like to use this scene to talk a bit about ABL automatic brightness limiters and give some nice little examples of how this can apply in the real world, so to speak, how you may observe it in action. So for the scene here, if I have the camera like this, then the ABL is not really kicking in. The monitor is outputting really nice brightness levels for the sky there, or the bits of the sky that you can actually see. But as you introduce more of the sky, and the average picture level increases, so it's displaying more bright shade, then that does cap the luminance. And it isn't just that it caps those very bright shades, you'll actually see shifts elsewhere. So the HUD elements there, for example, you'll be able to see them shift readily. I've now reduced peak brightness to medium rather than high. So this is one of the VESA Display HDR True Black 400 style settings. And the ABL shifts are less noticeable now. And actually they're exaggerated a bit on the video now. To my eye, the shifts in the HUD elements there, for example, they are more minor. And there's also just a generally more consistent look to things, and also a brighter look to lots of the medium shades and the medium brighter shades. So just keep that in mind. I will come back to this and talk a little bit more about it with another scene shortly and give some more specific examples of this. But basically, if you like a more consistent experience, you may prefer this setting. And I'm not going to show you the low setting, because it really on the video it's going to look exactly the same as this, but it has a slightly lower peak brightness, as I showed you with the graph earlier. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and this scene here, well, it's notoriously unforgiving for OLED monitors, causing ABL to kick in heavily. There are plenty of medium to bright shades being displayed, and as covered in the best settings video, setting the peak brightness to high, which is the HDR Peak 1000 style setting, that does cause the monitor to dim some shades to try to boost up the bright highlights as much as possible. That's what I was talking about with Cyberpunk as well. And this is due to power constraints, as the monitor would require too much power to display both the bright highlights at maximum brightness and all other shades at their requested brightness levels. Unfortunately though, as is often observed on QD-OLEDs, this still occurs in scenes like this, even though the ABL kicks in heavily and limits the maximum highlight brightness closer to Display HDR True Black 400 style levels. So for the sun here, I am using peak brightness set to high at the moment, and the game appropriately calibrated for that, by the way. I measured around 350 nits, although it's a touch higher or lower depending on what's going on with the rest of the scene. And I measured 88 nits for a patch of sky towards the top right of the screen, so just around there, and that is certainly dimmer than ideal. As noted in the best settings video, there are some ways to brighten up medium shades such as this. For example, you could set HDR tone mapping to active rather than static. This gives a bit of an uplift to the scene, with the sun staying a similar brightness to before, but the sky to the right is now recorded at 104 rather than 88 nits. The setting is a bit heavy-handed and indiscriminate with the uplift it gives, and I feel it raises up dark to medium shades too much in other scenes, and also actually for the rocks here, sort of overly bright, really, some of the medium dark shades there. And that gives a bit of a flooded look in places, and it upsets the atmosphere. And I'd also say that 104 nits for that sky, that is still quite low, and it can be improved further. I've just switched peak brightness over to medium, and I've also got the HDR tone mapping back to my preferred static setting. And as I mentioned before, this means it's a Display HDR True Black 400 style setting rather than HDR Peak 1000 style setting, with peak brightness set to medium rather than high. And the brightness of the sun, that remains similar, but the medium shades aren't dragged down in the same way, so the sky as a whole, it just appears brighter. I've recorded 147 nits for that usual patch of sky, so it's as if the monitor is limiting its average power consumption over time when setting peak brightness to high, anticipating that it may shortly have to show some very bright highlight where it isn't ABL limited. And I've now set the peak brightness to low, and I've recalibrated the game's HDR brightness appropriately, and that gives a further bump up to the brightness of the sky, so that usual patch is now reading 168 nits. The sun remains similar to using the other settings. I would say that overall I still do prefer peak brightness set to high as I enjoy the brighter highlights in some other scenes, where the monitor can reach around 1000 nits rather than being limited to around half that if you reduce the peak brightness setting. But really this one's going to come down to personal preferences. So I will be using peak brightness set to high for the remainder of this section of the review. Back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR. So this is the scene I showed you in the contrast section. I just thought I'd revisit that for a little bit of variety here. There's excellent depth to the shadow details and a lovely variety of closely matching dark shades. The overall detail levels are good and they're appropriate really under HDR. But as I mentioned, if you want to give more of an uplift to some of these shades, then you can do so. There are various ways to do that. Again, refer to that best settings video. And the way that this scene is displayed in terms of the bright elements is very nice as well. The monitor is pumping out lovely brightness for the fire there and the glowing skull eyes there as well. And again, there can be immediate transition between very bright shades and much darker shades, which gives lovely perceived contrast, and the per pixel illumination is doing its thing there as well. I also prefer the way that this monitor displays this scene compared to how WOLEDs display this scene, and that's because the colour volume is superior. It's able to show both high brightness and saturation at the same time. It doesn't have an unfiltered white subpixel providing the brightness. So in this scene, for example, WOLEDs, they will show an obvious white effect to the lava here, and it kind of does look like that on the video, to be honest. I have tried recording this in HDR, this particular scene, and it doesn't make a difference. What you see in the video is never accurate, but to the eye, I can actually see some really lovely bright oranges, bright yellows as well, rather than just bright whites, surrounded by dimmer, more saturated elements. So it's more blended and more appropriate. Strong saturation and brightness at the same time compared to what you get on WOLEDs. And the lava in the background there as well has a nice pinkish orange quality to it. Just adjusted the camera exposure to show you that it does have some nice little details. So if I think back to that Battlefield 5 mountains scene, that is displayed much better on mini LED solutions, or some mini LED solutions, because they don't have the same kind of ABL issues. They're able to show that mountain sun in a lovely bright way, and the sky lovely and bright, and any sort of glints, any highlights with beautiful brightness far beyond what this monitor can actually display. But this scene here is one where this QD-OLED panel does really well. So the silvery purple glint on the water surface there is really nice, and it's also displayed better than WOLEDs because it's displayed in a more blended way, with again some brightness and saturation at the same time, instead of having sort of solid white core surrounded by kind of purple fringe, which isn't bright but is kind of saturated. And at the same time, it's able to display a lovely variety of darker and medium dark shades here. And this is better than mini LED solutions will show as well, because they just lack the precision, because there's some very small dark shadow details here, and what will happen is they'll either show those shadow details in an uplifted way because they don't have the dimming zone number to do so. Well, I mean, they certainly don't have the millions of dimming zones that this monitor has. Or alternatively, what they will do is they will deepen the medium shades too much to try and show the darkest shades correctly. And again, a really nice atmosphere on this monitor, really nice dark look, but still some good subtle shade variety that you can pick out nicely. Again, various ways to give an uplift if you wish, as explored in the best settings video. Setting HDR tone mapping to active is a pretty straightforward way of achieving that kind of look if you prefer. On another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I'm going to talk now about colour reproduction under HDR. So unlike under SDR, developers can now target wider colour gamuts, or wider colour spaces, such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020, very large and generous gamut. So this monitor covers somewhere in the region of 80% Rec 2020, so there's not full Rec 2020 coverage, but as I explored earlier, and as you can see on the screen now, the DCI-P3 coverage is very strong. I recorded 98%. So with this, there can be some good vibrant shades where the developers intend them to be. So fires there, for example, some nice vibrant oranges and yellows there, but it's not overdone in the way that it is under SDR, and more muted shades also appear more appropriate because of the superior mapping of the wide gamut, rather than there being a target of sRGB and the gamut being natively much wider than that. So Lara's skin, not that you can see a lot of her skin in this particular scene, it's more toned down than it is under SDR. She doesn't have that kind of overly tanned look that you get using the native gamut under SDR. And her attire, her lovely green dress there, some nice vibrant looking greens, in the background there for the vegetation, but they're not overdone in the same way as they are under SDR, where they can have this overly bright and somewhat neon look. And they're still pushed up in a fairly saturated way, and there is a little bit of oversaturation still, but just not as much as under SDR. I can also notice a bit of oversaturation to the red shades there as well. I've noticed it elsewhere for terracotta roof tiles on this game as well, and other games. And I can also notice it a bit for the pottery there, just a little bit of extra saturation, a bit of a red push, but again, toned down a lot compared to under SDR. And there is a saturation slider which you can adjust if you really want to on the monitor anyway under HDR. Just be aware that you might find that you're starting to undersaturate some shades before you're reducing the saturation of the shades you actually want to reduce. So it can be very difficult to get the balance right. And to be honest, it really isn't a strong oversaturation setting things up as per my test settings under HDR. So it's really a look which most people are going to be pretty happy with. It's a nice eye-catching look to the golds there as well, some bright golds, and actually QD-OLEDs are quite good at showing this kind of shade. It's a really lovely quality to that actually. And again, for scenes like this, thinking again more really on the contrast side, the per pixel illumination means it's able to display the array of shades with really small, subtle shadow details, whilst immediately showing brighter shades surrounding it. The consistency, which I mentioned earlier in the review as well, the colour consistency, really helps the monitor provide consistent detail levels and shade depths throughout the entire screen as well. But again, I mean, if I look at the sky there, you might consider it looks a bit dimmer than it ideally would. And just to round off, I've switched over peak brightness to medium. And yes, this does give a more uplifted look to things. The sky does look brighter now, and a lot of the medium shades in the background, and just in general the scene, it's just brighter. And that's because the monitor's not dragging these shades down to try and make sure it can display strong highlights, even though there aren't any particularly strong highlights in this scene. And if you do prefer, again, this more uplifted look, there are various ways in this on this monitor that you can achieve that without going as far as reducing the peak brightness setting. But reducing the peak brightness setting is the most effective way of doing it, really, and it also won't affect the representation of darker shades in the way that achieving the uplift by other means will. I know this isn't ideal, having different scenes look really optimal with different settings on the monitor, but this is a common restriction with QD-OLEDs. Some people don't mind about it. For some people, the bright highlights and the overall representation of things is really nice and they're happy with it anyway, but I do like to point these things out as I know it is a bugbear for some people. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. I've got the game running at 360 frames a second, or most of the time it's there anyway. So I'm trying to make the most out of the monitor in terms of its refresh rate, which is 360 Hz. And with this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination, there are two main advantages. One is that it greatly improves the connected feel. That's the precision and the fluidity you feel when you interact with the game world. This is something which low input lag also helps with, and I measured 0.81 milliseconds on this monitor, so very low input lag. This combination really does give a lovely connected feel to things. And the high frame rate, high refresh rate combination also reduces perceived blur due to eye movement. When it comes to perceived blur, there are two main forms of it. One is related to the eye movement, and that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display, assuming that the frame rate is suitably high as well. And the other is the pixel responses of the monitor. They also play an important part. And there's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, which explores these kind of concepts in more detail and also looks at a method of photography called pursuit photography, which is able to capture motion on a screen in a way that reflects both elements of perceived blur nicely. So here are some pursuit photographs on the screen using Test UFO. The monitor is set to various different refresh rates. There are no overdrive settings to consider on this monitor. As usual for an OLED, you don't have to consider that, you don't have to worry about that. And you'll see that the increase in refresh rate does clear up the image itself, the main image. It becomes sharper and details become clearer. The step up from 60 to 120 Hz is significant, but there's still more to be had up to 240 Hz and also then up to 360 Hz. Because of the way that the test is rendered, it seems that the notches on the UFO, the white notches, they blend together at 360 Hz, whereas they're really quite distinct at 240 Hz or more distinct at 240 Hz. That's not a fault of the monitor or some kind of weakness with the monitor. That's just how the test's rendered. But if you look at the alien itself and its eyes and that kind of thing, those kind of fine details, and also the segmentation of the UFO in general is just a bit finer at 360 versus 240 Hz. And if you compare to the reference screen, and that is the AOC AG254FG, which is a 360 Hz IPS model, you'll see that that just doesn't have the same level of clarity as this OLED. not only with the object itself, but there are also some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, particularly for the dark background, which is the top row, some distinct powdery trailing behind the UFO, whereas on the OLED, there's no powdery trailing, there's no trailing to speak of at all, there's no overshoot which is perceived. There's all just a perfect sample and hold 360Hz performance on the OLED. And this is sample and hold. The monitor doesn't include a pixel strobing or BFI black frame insertion mode. For those preferring figures, here are some figures taken using the OSRTT Pro tool. This is the same tool and methodology used by TFT Central, although they tend to make some changes for OLEDs. The reason they do that is because the tool is pretty sensitive to the brightness regulation method used by OLEDs. It's not PWM, but there are cyclical dips in brightness corresponding to the refresh rate of the display, slight cyclical dips, and it just throws the measurements off a bit. That's particularly noticed for the first row of this test and also for some of the overshoot readings. But in practice, there's no perceived overshoot and the pixel responses are very fast. But either way, trying to sort of mentally filter those slightly higher than they should be figures out, or slightly higher than they actually are figures out, there's still a lot of green here anyway. Solid OLED performance. The average initial time is recorded as 1.04 milliseconds, so the initial response times are what are being shown in the table here. Again, the average is dragged up by some of these readings where the instrument is thrown off, the accuracy is thrown off. At 240Hz, more of the same, average initial time 1.03 milliseconds. Again, be aware of these sort of phantom readings, which I like to call them. In practice, there's no perceivable overshoot, no weaknesses at all observed with pixel responses. 120Hz, measurements went a bit crazy here. It's not even giving you the readings for some of these, but anyway, visually excellent performance here. And really, for what it is able to read accurately, a very good performance. And at 60Hz, 1.12 milliseconds average initial time recorded. Really nice green performance here. So back to my 360Hz, 360-ish frames a second gaming on Battlefield 5. I do notice a difference coming from 240 to 360Hz. In fact, I can notice this even on the desktop. But I wouldn't say that this upgrade makes me better at games necessarily, even if I notice it. And it isn't necessarily going to make you better at games, even if you play competitively. But some competitive players who do play at the highest levels and they're playing titles where they're really able to push the frame rates up very high, it is nice to have this extra refresh rate. I just don't expect it to work miracles and make you a much better player than you actually are, if that makes sense. But even the fine little details, like the mixtures of light and dark and medium shades here, there are no weaknesses from pixel responses to be aware of, and just good visual fluidity thanks to the lovely OLED 360Hz performance. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5, and this is one I would use on LCDs to show some other transitions, high contrast situations where there are dark shades against much brighter backgrounds and vice versa, and just various mixtures of shade which are quite unforgiving on LCDs. But in this case, there were no weaknesses in pixel responses to report. So I'm just going to move straight on to talking about VRR, variable refresh rate. And that's just as well on this scene because you will see that my frame rate is fluctuating quite a bit. It is not staying at 360 frames a second. I don't know if you can see that in the video, but it's sort of going all over the place between the high 200s and up to 360, but generally the high 200s to low 300 frames a second range. And the monitor is using VRR. It supports VRR via Adaptive Sync and HDMI 2.1 VRR, so you can use the trio of HDR technologies, including AMD FreeSync, Nvidia G-Sync compatible, and HDMI 2.1 VRR. I'm using an RTX 3090 at the moment connected via DisplayPort if you're interested, and using Nvidia G-Sync compatible. So the range of operation for VRR on this one is 48 to 360Hz, and if your game runs below 48 frames a second, then LFC, low frame rate compensation, can kick in, so the monitor can stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. As usual, LFC doesn't kick in at exactly 48 frames a second, 48 Hz all the time. It does depend, certainly on my Nvidia GPU, it did depend on the actual changes occurring in the refresh rate, or the frame rate fluctuations. So sometimes it activated closer to 55 Hz. Sometimes between those two values. It doesn't make much of a difference. Just be aware that if you're frequently passing that boundary, then there can be some stuttering which you might notice. And you also have to be aware of VRR flickering, which this monitor does have as an OLED monitor. It is something which it's affected by. And there are fluctuations occurring now. So, it's going roughly between 250 and 360 frames a second at the moment. And this doesn't give strong flickering by any means. I mean, there's some light flickering I can see in the sky, and for some of the darker shades, just slight flickering. But this really isn't eye-catching or obvious flickering here in this particular range. It can be more noticeable at lower frame rates or lower refresh rates, or if there are extreme fluctuations, so it goes down from 360 to 60 Hz, for example, to give an extreme example. But I will focus on this a little bit more very shortly, but for now I'm just going to focus on 120 Hz. I've come all the way down to 120 Hz just to show you or talk a little bit about how it feels now. Yes, the connected feel is not there at all compared to what I was getting before, although it's still reasonable, certainly much better than at 60 Hz. But there is an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement as well because of the lower frame rate, because VRR doesn't give you a higher frame rate, it just gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. And indeed it is doing that very nicely. And because the refresh rate's nice and stable, I'm not getting any VRR flickering of note. And you don't have to worry about overshoot as your refresh rate dips either, because there aren't any issues with overshoot regardless of the refresh rate. Now we're in at a nice solid, or not so nice solid, 60 Hz, 60 frames a second. Again, the connected feel, it's really gone now. It doesn't feel nice at all, especially not compared to those much higher refresh rates and frame rates. And a big increase in perceived blur due to eye movement, but no overshoot and no weaknesses in pixel responses. Visually flawless, so to speak, 60 Hz sample and hold performance. And be aware that with OLEDs like this, having such fast pixel responses, sometimes you can notice low frame rate judder a bit more, and that's something which comes into play more if you're watching movie content, particularly low frame rate movie content, sort of 24 to 30 frames a second. You may notice juddering a bit more because there isn't sort of a extra mask of perceived blur from any weaknesses in pixel responses whatsoever. I'm just going to talk a bit more about VRR flickering. It is something which you would tend to notice most readily in game menus or loading screens. So the game menu here, I can see it to my eye, I don't know how it'll appear in the video, quite readily for the boat there, the darker shades for the boat. And it's because for loading screens and in-game menus, there are often very sudden changes in refresh rate or momentary dips in refresh rate that can cause this kind of thing. And you can notice it in-game, it just depends on your system, what game you're playing and the scenes, so it does happen from time to time when you're gaming as well. But this test here shows it very nicely, and there's a lot of VRR flickering going on this test. It causes significant changes in refresh rate, very rapid and significant changes in refresh rate. Again, you can get that in game sometimes, but generally you're not going to get the kind of fluctuations that are occurring here. And you're also not going to have a nice little gradient here, which really makes it super obvious where the flickering is occurring. And it's for the darker shades, the dark to medium shades. You might see it in the video elsewhere, but to the eye, it's really the medium to dark shades where you're going to be noticing the flickering. It's the same in games, the shadow details, the darker shades where you're going to notice it. And I'm just on Cyberpunk, and the loading screen here actually does show some VRR flickering, although it's got flickering lights, which are also flickering, but you can see it for the background there, which shouldn't be flickering, but it is flickering because of VRR flickering. Yeah, you get it. But I really wanted to show you some in-game examples. And again, the flickering, it's noticed pretty readily here. And if I go on information, it shows that the monitor is hovering around 90 Hz, but it is sort of changing quite a bit. Depends on where I'm looking in the scene. So there are, sometimes it goes above 100. But really the frame rate is a lot lower than I was showing you with Battlefield 5 before. And there are definite fluctuations, sudden changes occurring, and it's enough to cause VRR flickering. It's not extreme flickering, it's not intense flickering in this case, but that's because the fluctuations aren't exactly extreme. They can still be noticed. And I find them actually more noticeable on this scene because they're even darker shades. It's easier to capture on the video as well. You'll probably be able to see it more readily on the video. The fluctuations are a bit stronger here. Not huge fluctuations in absolute numbers, but remember, as a percentage of the refresh rate, they are greater. That does make a difference as well. So when you're at the lower end, so you're in the double digits, a change of 10 frames a second there is going to give you more noticeable flickering than if you're at, say, 200 frames a second and it suddenly drops 10 frames a second. But it's very difficult to actually capture this accurately in the video because sometimes the flickering is more noticeable on the video. So for the pillar there, for example, really noticeable on the video, but to the eye, not as much. But sometimes I notice flickering. That was a flashing light, by the way, not flickering. Sometimes I notice flickering to the eye, which isn't captured so well on the video, but you get the idea, it's there. And I'd say that in general, it's really much in line with what I've seen on other QD-OLEDs. At high refresh rates, your relative change isn't going to be as much as a percentage as I was mentioning before. I want also to quickly mention there is something called VRR control on this monitor, and that's been used on Samsung monitors for several years now. I don't know exactly what it does, but it does get rid of the flickering, but it also, or at least massively minimizes it, but it also introduces annoying micro stuttering, so it's kind of like half VRR in a way. So if you're really sensitive to flickering, but not so sensitive to stuttering, it might be worth checking this out. But for me, it kind of spoils the VRR experience, and I just prefer the smoothness of actually having proper VRR enabled. Also, there seems to be a latency penalty associated with it. I didn't actually take measurements with the setting enabled, but I could feel that there was extra latency. To wrap up then, overall, quite like the design of this monitor. I think the styling is quite sleek, and I like the metal stand. I do like a bit of metal, at least for the base of the stand. Wouldn't have minded some on the neck of the stand as well, but I think there was still enough metal on this monitor to keep me happy. Also at the rear of the monitor it was mainly metal. The RGB LED lighting solution as well, I mean it's on at the moment, you probably can't tell because the room's a bit bright. But at least if you're sitting in a dimly lit room, it does give you a bit of ambience. So it's better than some LED solutions in that respect, but certainly not the brightest I've seen from that kind of thing. The contrast performance, well, that's as expected for QD-OLED, so really very strong in many respects. But an interesting slant on this one was given by the screen surface being a matte screen surface rather than glossy. Now this did not eliminate the lightening up or the colourful tint introduced in brighter environments, but it did sort of offset it to a degree. That's mainly because the screen will be diffusing glare across the surface, which sort of blends in with the lightening up or the colourful tint which is introduced on the screen surface, and perhaps the matte film does actually just reduce it slightly anyway. Either way, I did feel it was less noticeable as a distinct feature than it is on the glossy QD-OLED screens, and it doesn't have the same clarity and pop that glossy screen surfaces have, and that's because of the diffused glare competing with the image. But the glare handling was exceptionally good, I have to say. And also the image was not grainy and there was not obvious layering in front of the image as you get with some matte screen surfaces. So I do think that actually many people will quite like the screen surface on this monitor. I think it's pretty agreeable as far as matte screen surfaces go. And I preferred it to the WOLED matte screen surfaces because it was less grainy and there was less noticeable layering to me. The colour performance, again, typical QD-OLED territory, very impressive as well. Exceptional colour consistency, excellent DCI-P3 coverage, and very strong Adobe RGB coverage. And the monitor had some nice emulation settings as well for DCI-P3 and sRGB, and they worked well. They didn't restrict your settings either, so that's a nice flexibility to have. Using the full native gamut, certainly a vibrant experience. Under HDR, the monitor was extremely configurable, which I think was both a good and bad thing. Good in the sense that you have a lot of flexibility, bad in the sense that if you like to tweak things, you might find yourself endlessly tweaking and sort of messing up the image. It's certainly possible to mess up the image under HDR, or you may be just not quite finding your ideal settings or not thinking you have. But actually, I feel with minimal tweaking and sticking to the Eco preset, or one of the similarly configured ones, it's actually a well-calibrated HDR experience overall. There's a little bit of extra saturation to some shades, but toned down significantly compared to under SDR. I did make good use of the colour gamut overall. The brightness capabilities as well. Well, it was the usual QD-OLED experience in this respect. You sort of have to consider which mode you want to use. The ones that give you the highest peak brightness will also dim medium shades elsewhere in the image. So there's a bit of a compromise. It would be nicer if you didn't have to make that compromise. But I still think the overall HDR performance was strong. And also the colour volume is praiseworthy as well, because it's able to display strong saturation and brightness at the same time, rather than having an unfiltered white subpixel as WOLEDs have, which dilutes the image in that respect. The responsiveness of the monitor, really strong, super strong 360Hz performer, very low input lag, no weaknesses in pixel responses to worry about. It didn't have a BFI or black frame insertion mode. I mean, that might have been considered the icing on the cake if it did have one of those, especially one that would work at 360Hz, but it doesn't. You're just left with a very strong 360Hz sample and hold performance. VRR did work as it should. The VRR flickering as usual. It's not something that everyone's going to notice. It just depends on the fluctuations occurring for you and your sensitivity to flickering. So overall, I think this is a really nice option. If you consider the overall package, the sort of unique nature of the matte QD-OLED solution they've got going here as well, the overall styling and the price, I do think it's a compelling option and it's one that I'm happy to recommend. Of course, there are various competing glossy options if you want to go down that route. And I mean, there are WOLED options as well. I do consider this superior to the WOLEDs. Just personal preference really, but I just like the extra colour volume for HDR. I find the fringing less obnoxious on QD-OLEDs as well. And I like the fact that even though this is a matte surface, it isn't a grainy matte surface, unlike the WOLED models. But that is something I'm very fussy about. And of course, if you are using the monitor for productivity, regardless of which OLED technology you go for, there is the risk of burn-in, especially if you're using it extensively for productivity. For a bit of productivity on the side and mainly entertainment use, it isn't something I worry about, but if you're primarily using a monitor for productivity, you might want to consider an LCD alternative instead. So that's really all there is to the Samsung Odyssey G60SD. In the description of the video, you'll find additional content as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.